Velma is an adult animated comedy series based on the character Velma Dinkley from the Scooby-Doo franchise. It stars executive producer Mindy Kaling as the voice of the titular character with a litany of others in supporting roles. The show revolves around Velma and the other human members of the Mystery Inc. before their official formation. Velma is haunted by a number of issues, but its greatest sin is that at a base level, the show does try too hard with its meta humor. So much so that the self-aware jokes weren't held together by the internal strength of their comedic punch, but that the actual comedy of any given interaction was limited to the fact that the jokes themselves were self-aware. Critics within the South Asian community have additionally focused on Velma's toxic misrepresentation of young, adolescent South Asian women, as well as how this version of Velma does not depict a healthy or even nuanced understanding of Velma's South Asian identity. Her identity as a South Asian person of color was relegated to a few racially targeted jokes, which worked to undermine the very point of a South Asian version of Velma. This is not Velma being given a South Asian voice and led to be understood through that lens, but a South Asian actress speaking through a South Asian passing IP with little to no through line between that. With that having been said, Velma was a show of high highs and very low lows, and I would be doing the show and my audience a disservice if I focused on the negatives and let that be the determining factor of the show's quality. It would be disingenuous to insist that even with its low IMDb score, no one could engage with it authentically. I liked it in part for what it was, and even in a show that ostensibly deviates from its internal lore, it doesn't spend too much time reintroducing these characters, and so much of its world is able to be presupposed. Not discounting the criticism from South Asian people of color, I do quite like Mindy Kaling's expression of Velma's neuroses, and while this is not my favorite version of Velma, I do find the reimagining of the character to be authentically engaging. We do not benefit critically from refusing to understand the show in an authentic fashion. The show has this sort of creative verve that I like. In the first episode, we are introduced to Norville, who keeps mentioning that he's been trying to call Velma and has left her multiple voicemails, or as he calls them, VMs. The comedy is in his fixation with both Velma's not responding to his calls as well as his need to be understood by her by placing emphasis on the fact that he calls voicemails VMs. Without being explicit about that fact, this allows us to understand Norville's view of himself and his feelings towards Velma. It was a funny bit, and I like this introduction of this character. Unlike every other character in the show, Norville's place within the narrative is a hell of a lot more coherent. He's also a lot more emotionally well-rounded than every other character in the show, even though he never really follows through on those strengths, opting to devolve into his worst impulses in service of Velma's needs. A significant part of his appeal is in injecting a bit of awareness and looking within in an effort to understand Velma's dismissal of his feelings. It's not that he doesn't understand that she doesn't have feelings for him, it's more so that he doesn't want to admit that the person he cares about most in the world would rather be with anyone else but him. So he always has to coat his attempts to win her affection with elaborate trope-based romantic encounters or mask them as the very jokes that Velma seems to interpret them as. I don't want this to be a Norville episode, so let's talk about the character of Velma. It's important to understand that her dismissal of Norville's feelings doesn't make her a bad or even mean-spirited character. At minimum, it makes her a flawed character but not a bad one. It's okay that for someone so self-aware to the point of being meta, she cannot accurately read the emotional states of others, even those she calls her friends and family. Velma being flawed is okay. Velma's entire thing is that she's drawn to mysteries, and very early on in the show, she finds herself a part of one. The show does the whole main character solves mysteries, but the one mystery she can solve is herself, or in this case, the one mystery she can solve is her mother's disappearance. Now, not every archetype has to be a deconstruction or an innovation in order for its existence to be justified. The themes underlying this trope form a thesis statement for the entire show as a whole. Both descriptions apply, in part, to Velma's character and work in harmony to explore her flaws. These characters are all teenagers, and as the show goes on, what they need to understand and explore about themselves is framed like a mystery that each of them has to solve. To understand the chaotic mess that is her trauma-fueled hallucinations, Velma needs to find the source of her guilt in relation to her mother's disappearance, and sometimes this just takes the form of a desire to find her mother. Norville needs to both confront his feelings for Velma and admit to himself that, as the show goes on, their needs have diverged. But he's not ready to do that. So he keeps pulling at Velma's thread, hoping that somewhere along the way it will lead him where he needs to go. Daphne seeking out her birth parents speaks to an inherent desire to find a piece of oneself that is missing. Her and Velma's romantic entanglement in episode 3 was the source of the drama because neither was ready or even willing to admit that that moment it meant something. Fred was unfathomable as a character, and unlike the other members of the Mystery Inc., he was the only one who felt like he was following a set path instead of treading his own. His personal desires were always in service of a greater narrative and did little to impose on the overall story, which would be fine for a side character, but this is Fred. I mean, Scooby-Doo lore aside, he is still a beloved IP and the leader of the Mystery Inc. I think Velma having the agency of a main character delegated Fred's status within the lore to something akin to a mix between Shaggy and Scooby-Doo, but without the charm of either. He's also the only one who seemed insensitive to the world around him, even as he was charged with murder or kidnapped by a killer. He doesn't seem to grasp the breadth of the situation, and I know it's supposed to be funny, and trust me, it was hilarious, but it makes him seem one-dimensional by comparison. Velma as a TV show is not perfect, but it's surprisingly well made, with a stellar voice cast including Gary Cole and Glenn Howerton, whom I love. There were moments of greatness that were ultimately undercut by a fundamentally flawed script and understanding of the IP. Even though the whole was less than the sum of its parts, I really did enjoy Velma. Thank you for watching.